Good morning. Today's daf is daf Ayin Dalid. We are at the two dots near the bottom, a few lines from the bottom of Ayin Gimel and Mabet. Let me share my screen and we will get started. So yesterday we began the seventh chapter of Masechet Menachot, and we saw in our Mishnah the following debate. Tanakama says that there is no kamitza for a sinner's mincha that belongs to a Kohen. And the whole mincha in its totality is all burned together. Rabbi Shimon says, no, the kamitza is done for a sinner's mincha that belongs to a Kohen, and the kamitza and the remnants are each burned on their own. So obviously everybody agrees that it's all burned because the Torah tells us that it's all burned, or at least we derive from the Torah that it's all burned. But and everybody agrees on that front. But the question is, do they do kamitza or not? So as we pick up at the start of the 12th line from the bottom of Ayin Gimel Mabet, the
What would be
Gemara.
the nafkamina? I mean, to take the kamitza, it's going to burn it anyway. So what's his rationale? Why would even?
Well, that's exactly, you're asking the exact question that the Gemara is about to ask. Now, there in practicality, we'll see that there isn't much of a difference, but we'll see because obviously everybody agrees that it's not you're not supposed to eat it. But the question is how do we ideally engage in the service? Obviously, there are lots of things where you could do it in multiple ways. We talked about, for example, the applications of blood, where one often is sufficient. You don't have to do all of them, but you're supposed to do all of them. What's the nafkamina between doing one and all of them? It's just, one is what Hashem wanted, and the other is a little less ideal. So that's the story. But so here again, we're picking up and we're going to quote Rabbi Shimon's position, which of course is the one that effectively defines the Tanakama's position. And so we quote Rabbi Shimon Omer Minchas Kote Shel Kohanim, etc. So now Gemara asks, Mina and Emili, how do I know this? Now, in fact, the answer that the question ordinarily would seem to be primarily on Rabbi Shimon, but our brisa that we're about to quote is going to actually give us the answer as to how we know this, both for the Tanakama and for Rabbi Shimon. So let's hear. To Tana Rabbanan, we got a brisa. V'haisa la kohen kamincha. The pasuk in Vayikra Perek Hey, pasuk Yud Gimel, very end of last week's, or near the end of last week's parsha of Parshas Vayikra. So it says that it'll be for the kohen like the mincha, right? And so, and this is referring to a kohen who is obligated to bring a sinner's mincha. Shetehei avodasa ksherabo, that it is kosher, that it is valid to bring a for the kohen himself to bring the mincha when he is the sinner. That's the lesson that we get from that, because la kohen kamincha, meaning that the kohen himself has the ability to bring it. Maybe you're telling me that this pasuk is these words are teaching that the Kohen himself can do the work. But how do I know that he can do that? Maybe what it's telling us, la kohen kamincha, that it'll be like a mincha, meaning just as the mincha of a regular non kohen is edible by a Kohen, so too the sinner's mincha, maybe that's also edible by the Kohen. Well, if that were true, and then umani miskayem, and if you were to say that, you'd wonder, well, how do you fulfill the following verse that says v'kol minchas kohen kalil tiyeh lo seachel? It says that every mincha of a kohen should be entirely burned and is not eaten. So what is that referring to? Minchas nidvaso. That's only referring to the voluntary offerings. But maybe if he's obligated because he sinned, then he would be able to, the mincha would get eaten. So Talmud Lomar, v'haisa la kohen kamincha. So that's why the pasuk says that it'll be for the kohen like a mincha. That makish chovaso linidvaso. That when it says it'll be for the kohen like a mincha, it means like the kohen's mincha. Meaning, just as a kohen's mincha is not eaten by the kohen, so too the kohen's mincha as a sinner is also not eaten by a kohen. Makish chovaso linidvaso. So we connect the obligatory mincha to the voluntary mincha. Manidvaso enunechelis, just as the voluntary one is not eaten. Avchovaso enunechelis, so too the obligatory one is not eaten. And so as a result, that's we effectively learn that he can himself bring it, and it's not talking about the ability to eat. Rather, it's confirming that it is not edible, not that it is not, it is prohibited to be eaten. So Amar Rabbi Shimon. So now the Brisa cites Rabbi Shimon and explains his view. So again, the main view is that essentially the sinners, the ko that when if the Kohen is bringing a sinner's mincha, it's just like a regular mincha in that that is brought by a Kohen. In that it is all burned. There's no kamitza that's associated with it, and everything is exactly as we saw in the Mishnah, according to the Tanakhama. But
Now,
Rabbi
if a
Shimon,
non-Cohen brings a chata, right?
a
A
sinner's
mincha,
mincha,
right?
then it gets
Who eats
eaten.
it? Who
The
eats it?
Kohen, the Kohen, Kohen.
So the question is,
Any chatas would be brought by
right,
eaten by
exactly.
Kohen.
So in this case, I'm just thinking, does the Gemara ever entertain the thought that this Cohen could give it to another Cohen to offer, and that the second Cohen could eat it?
No, 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 because it not that I'm aware of. No, the pasuk that we derive this all from is generic about the Kohanim not being able to eat it. It doesn't distinguish the Kohen who brings it from other Kohanim. And most likely, the reason that it doesn't distinguish between the two is for precisely your reason. Meaning, if a Kohen could just give it to another Kohen and have that other Kohen eat it, well, then that's exactly what everybody would do, and they would trade it all off. And we saw already that you're not allowed to do that trade. So, maybe one of the reasons that Hashem would have made that general prohibition is in order to avoid that issue. Not 100% clear, but in any event, certainly there is no ability to give it to another Kohen and evade the prohibition about a Kohen eating a mincha brought by a Kohen. Okay, so Amar Rabbi Shimon. So now we have Rabbi Shimon's view, and remember, Rabbi Shimon says you do the kamitza, except that it all gets burned. The kamitza gets burned, and the shirayim gets burned. So b'chin nehemar v'haisa la kohen kimincha. So does listen? Let's look at that verse. It didn't say. What does it say? It says v'haisa la kohen kamincha. It should be for the kohen like a mincha. It does not say like his mincha. Lo nemar ela kamincha. It just says like a mincha, like the mincha. So ela hakish. So as a result, that teaches us that we have a comparison. Minchas chote shel kohanim keminchas chote shel Yisrael. That we have to the comparison isn't a mincha of a sinner who's a kohen to a mincha of a Kohen who's not a sinner. That was our first interpretation. That's how the Tanakhama understands it. But rather, it's connecting the minchas of a sinner who's a Kohen to a mincha of a sinner who's not a Kohen. So minchas chote shel Kohanim keminchas chote shel Yisrael. Man minchas chote shel Yisrael nikmetzes, just as a sinner's mincha who's not a Kohen, the Kohen is going to do a kamitza av minchas chote shel Kohanim nikmetzes. So too, there's a kamitza for the Kohen's mincha sinner mincha offering. Ima chot minchas chote shel Yisrael nikmetzes v'shireh nachelen. Well, one second. And if you're going to say, well, why don't we say that just as when it comes to the minchas chote of Yisrael, it's eaten, the leftovers are eaten. Av minchas chote shel kohanim nikmetzet shira nechel, and maybe the leftovers should be eaten. So Talmud lomar la kohen kamincha. La kohen kamincha, meaning that it's going to be to the kohen as like a mincha, that it's like a mincha, right, with respect to the kohen's avoda, it's like a mincha. The lowly ishim kamincha, but it's not when it comes to the fire like a mincha. So when it comes to the avoda of kamitza, that's obviously going to be just like the non-Kohen's sinner offering. You'll have the Kohen sinner offering. But when it comes to the fire, so then no, it's different because the entire thing goes to the fire. So as Rashi tells us, yeah. Oh, yeah, look who that is. Okay, exactly. So Haketzad. So how does that work out? Kometz karev ba'atzmo, v'shirayim karevim ba'atzman. You bring both the co-mates onto the altar and you bring the remnants, the leftovers onto the altar. As Rashi tells us, La Kohen Kamincha, third line on Ayin Dalet Amud Aleph, Klomer, Kol Sheyesh La Kohen La'asot Ba, everything that the Kohen is supposed to do with respect to a sinner's offer, mincha offering that does not belong to a Kohen. Yehei Kiminchas Chote Shel Yisrael, to Nick Metzis, just like the mincha of a sinner offering who's not a Kohen, that it gets kamitza. V'lo ishim kamincha, continuing on in the next Rashi, fourth line, end of the line, in Ayin Dalet and Aleph. Le'inyan mizbeach, when it comes to the altar, Ain shavin, they're not equivalent. Minchas kote shel kohanim, minchas kote shel Yisrael. The mincha of a sinner who's a kohen and the mincha of a sinner who's not. Deshire minchas kote shel Yisrael ne'achalim, because the minchas of a sinner who's a not a Yisrael gets eaten, and minchas kote shel kohanim karivin. But when it comes to the mincha of a sinner who's a kohen, it all gets brought to the altar. Okay, so as a result, now we see exactly what we wanted, which is the source for Rabbi Shimon's teaching. Rabbi Shimon says that because the pasuk says, "V'haisa kohen kamincha," and not kamincha, so it teaches that you need to have a kamitza. It all gets burned, but it needs to have a kamitza. Okay, so hashetehei avodas akshay rabo. Now you told me at the very beginning of this brisa that the sukkim the word v'haisala kohen kamincha teach us that the kohen himself is able to do the service. Mehecha nafka. Mehacha nafka, rather, mehasam nafka. It isn't learned from that verse. It's learned somewhere else because we have a brisa. Minayin lakohen sheba umakri korban asav b'chol esa b'chol shasha yirtza. How do I know that a kohen can offer his own sacrifice anytime he wants, anywhere, at any point, meaning anytime during the year and at any point during the day? Talmud lomar uva b'chol avas nafsho v'sheres. A different pasuk. This is a pasuk in Dvarim Parak Yurchet. It's actually the part of two psukim. The first four words there are from pasuk Vav, and the last word Visheres is from pasuk Zayin. But the concept is all the same, meaning that the Kohen's going to come whenever he wants to offer a sacrifice, and he's going to serve. Well, so doesn't that show that that's the source for a Kohen being able to offer his own sacrifice? No, not that source is not sufficient. If we only had that source, Havamina, I would have thought, Hani mili davar she'ein ba al chet, that's only when he has a voluntary offering that doesn't come as a result of a sin. Aval davar sheba al chet ein malo, but maybe if it's not voluntary and it's because he sinned, maybe he would not be allowed to offer it. So v'hanami mehacha nafka mehasam nafka. Oh, you want to tell me that we learn from the words "V'haisala kohen kamincha" that he can offer even a sinner's offering if it's his own offering. But we see that somewhere else we know that the kohen can offer his own sinner offering because it says this is Bamidbar Perek Tes Vav Pasuk Kafchet. So the end of Parshas Shlach. Where it says that the pasuk says the Kohen shall effect atonement for the one who erred, for the soul who erred, and when he sins through an unintentional sin, sins unintentionally. So now the Rashi points out here that you didn't need the v'chata avishkaga, the last words of that pasuk. So why do we repeat it? It teaches that the Kohen himself can do the atonement. The Kohen has the ability. So again, we don't need the words Kohen kamincha, because that we don't need it to teach us about a Kohen bringing his own mincha offering, because we see that the Kohen is allowed to bring his own sin offering from the pasuk at the end of Parsha Shlach. So Imeahu, no, if we only had that verse, or only had those first two verses, the first one again tells us that he can bring voluntary offerings. This one is telling us he could bring sin offerings. Havamina, I would have thought, or I would have said, Hani mili b'shogeg. That's only when he sinned accidentally, right? The pasuk is talking about hanefesh hashogeges, and he sinned inadvertently, unintentionally. Aval b'mezid lo. But if he sinned deliberately, it would not be so. So kamash malan, that even if he sinned intentionally, it would be fine. But Mezid Hechem is like, 1 second though. Ordinarily, when you bring a korban for a sin, you don't bring a korban chatas. If you sin intentionally, you don't bring a korban chatas. You get punished. There is no sin offering for intentional sins, or at least in general, there isn't one. So where is this situation that you're talking about? So the Gemara continues, no, bizdon shvua, where you intentionally make an oath and violate it. And what is that referring to? That's referring to the following situation. Let's take a look in Rashi. We'll do aval amazid. It's 1, 2, 3. Again, when we say Rashi, we mean the Rashi on the right-hand side of the page, not on the bottom right-hand side of the page, not the Kisvei Yad. And we'll refer to the Kisvei Yad shortly. But about amazid, kagon hecha dahavyan nami amazid, kagon asham charufa ushmiyas kol lo yakriv ba'atzmo. That maybe you would say, this is on the comment that said that when it came to intentional sins, maybe you would not be allowed to bring it. So, and what are the two examples that Rashi here gives? One is the asham of a charufa. That is where a woman who is half slave, half free, and the only person that she can marry is a Jewish slave, an Evet Ivri, and they are now set up to be married. And of course, the marriage is only applying to effectively half of the woman, but because the Evet Ivri has the ability to be both with a non-Jewish slave and a free Jewish woman. So this woman who's half slave, half free Jewish woman, can marry her, can marry him. And as a result, if in fact they are engaged to be married and somebody sleeps with her, somebody else sleeps with her, even if it was intentional, they bring in asham shivcha charufa, and that asham is a sacrifice for an intentional sin. And another example, ushmias kol lo yakriv and shmias kol, and that is a situation that's actually at the end of last week's Parshas Vayikra, where somebody is asked to testify, and they say, "I have no idea what you're talking about," and they swear falsely, intentionally, saying that they have no idea, and then they admit that they did something wrong. They are subject to a korban ola v'yored, and that means that it could even be a mincha offering. So if they're particularly poor. And so as a result, that also is a situation where one sins intentionally. There are two other, by the way, although Rashi mentions two of them, there are two other situations. If a Nazir becomes tamei, then he also brings in asham, even if it was a deliberate transaction, a deliberate violation, transgression. And if you were to falsely deny under oath the fact that you were watching something for somebody else, that would also be another example of a situation where you are obligated in an offering, and so you're off subject to a penalty of an asham, and you would but again you make offer a sacrifice even though you sinned intentionally. But in general, it's true that you don't, if you sin intentionally, there is no sacrifice that can gain you atonement.
So
Okay.
that's a shomer sachar who denies that he was a shomer sachar. Is that the case?
It's any kind of picadon. It's any kind of oath that is that the person denies completely, and the person says where he where the question is where it was a whether I think it applies whether the person was a paid watcher or unpaid watcher.
Why would
So
it? Why would a shomer chinam be? Why would that be the case? He's not.
because
He doesn't take an oath. He doesn't. He's not getting paid. He's not. I mean, he's putter,
ex-
isn't he? Isn't he putter? Aveda the gazela, right?
Yes, but he can't falsely deny. I'll have to double check whether it also applies to an unpaid watcher. But certainly you're right that it applies to at least a paid watcher. That's what we're talking about. We're talking about where it's a watcher, not a borrower or a renter. So here, the person who gave somebody something to watch, and then he comes back and he says, "Give me back my thing that I gave you to watch." And the person says, "I don't know what you're talking about," and swears that in fact he doesn't know what they're talking about, and then later admits it and realizes that he wants to gain atonement. In that situation, he has to bring a carbon asham. I had to double check whether it's both a paid and unpaid watcher, but I'll have
Uh-huh.
that for you, God willing, tomorrow.
Now, did you say that a an Eved Ivri can marry a non-Jew? If this,
An Eved Ivri can marry a non-Jewish slave.
where do we see that a Jew could marry a non-Jew and it'd be the
Well,
king
first of all, a
the
non-Jewish slave is considered sort of like subject to mitzvot. There's a whole discussion of whether or
right,
not they have
right.
to. So but that's exactly what the Torah says, right? The Torah says in Parshas Mishpatim, it says that that you can that when you buy an Eved Ivri, that you can marry, you have him have children with your shifcha, with your maidservant who's not Jewish, and the children of that marriage, or the children
Are
of that
not Jewish,
relationship, it's not even a marriage, the
right?
children of that relationship become slaves.
But they're not Jewish.
Correct. They're not Jewish until they're freed. Correct.
Well,
They're not fully Jewish until they're freed.
if the shifcha was not Jewish in the beginning, and the Eved Ivri has relations with her, how do they become Jewish when they're freed? I mean, they weren't Jewish in
That
the
is
beginning.
true for every Eved. It
Right.
doesn't make a difference whether they're every Eved who's not Jewish, when they get freed, they become a full-fledged Jew. And while they're an Eved, they're subject to all mitzvahs that's not Zman Groma. All mitzvahs aseh not Zman Groma, and all lotases. So that from a significant perspective, indeed, the Rambam, I believe, says that they have to go through some level of they have to go into the mikvah and accept
That's what
some
I'm thinking.
aspect.
There has to be some level of gerut,
Yes,
not just the
100%.
kids. Oh,
But
okay.
that's required for all slaves. It's
Yeah,
required for
okay.
all
So they,
slaves.
they don't
Yeah,
become
for
a
all
Jewish
non-Jewish slaves, all non-Jewish slaves.
until they go through some measure of gerut. Other than
No, no,
that,
there's no when the slave gets freed, there isn't a formal conversion ceremony. All of the conversion has to, whatever conversion happens, and it's not clear. This is, certainly the Torah never says that when you buy a slave who's not Jewish, you need to take him to the mikveh and go to the mikveh. That the Torah never says that.
but they have to
But
accept that Ol Malchut Shemaim, the Kabbalat.
not completely clear. It seems like from just just our text, it would seem that you would say that the person becomes effectively Jewish without actually any conversion process. So the rabbis, like I said, institute some aspect of conversion process, but that's not completely clear in any event. But the bottom line is we're talking about shifcha charufa, not the topic for right now,
I
and
understand
completely
that.
irrelevant. But
Right,
but just to make clear, the situation is the woman herself was owned by two different owners. One of them freed half of her, and
right,
so now she's half slave, half free.
right.
But one person who can marry both a free Jewish woman and a slave non-Jewish woman can is a Jewish slave, an Eved Ivri. So if that person was set up to marry them, and then
I
somebody
mean,
has
marriage is a
relation.
strong word here because I don't think Kedushin is
Well,
chal.
no, because there's a marriage on the free half. So
Right,
there
okay,
is
right.
so
Yeah, okay.
so so they set up to marry her. So it is the right word. And so as a result, now in that situation, you're going to have if somebody now who's not this husband to be sleeps with her, then the sacrifice that needs to happen is an asham shivcha harufa. At least that is one understanding of what is meant by the whole shivcha harufa situation.
The
Okay,
person who sleeps with her has to bring is the chai of the korban here, right? The person who,
correct. The one who sleeps with her illegally.
and he
All right.
must be a Jewish, right?
Yeah, of
Obviously.
course. Obviously, if he's not Jewish, then he's not subject to any
Right,
sacrifices.
right.
Okay, Tanya Idach. So now we have so our Mishnah offered two views of what happens to a Kohen's sinner's mincha, but now the Gemara quotes a brisa that offers a third view from the son of Rabbi Shimon himself. Tanya Idach. Rabbi Shimon Omer minchas koteshal kohanim nikmetzes va'kometz covered b'fnei atzmo v'ashiraim karevim b'fnei atzman. So Rabbi Shimon says exactly what he said in the Mishnah, namely you do kamitza, and the kamitza and the shirayim are offered separately. Rabbi Lazar ben Rabbi Shimon Omer, Rabbi Lazar, his son, said, "Hakomitz karev ba'atzmo, v'ashirayim mispazbrin al beis hadeshin." That the komitz is brought by itself and it's brought on the altar, and the left and the what's the remnants, the leftovers of the mincha, they are spread out, they are scattered on the Beit Hadeshen, the location of the ashes. So Amar Rabbi Chia bar Abba Habiba Rabbi Yochanan wondered about this. Beis Hadeshen dehecha, which Beis Hadeshen are we talking about? Idilamala hainu avua. If you're telling me about the site of ashes on top of the altar, because some of the ashes would be moved over to facilitate everything burning properly, and so there was a pile of ashes on top of the altar, well, then that's exactly what his father said, meaning that the father said that it's on top of the altar. Idilamata, and if you're telling me it's below, yesh davar shekarav lamata, is there anything that is actually supposed to lichatchila get burned and destroyed and not put on the altar? So Amarle Rabbi Abba Dilma leibud. Maybe the purpose of doing this is just to destroy it and not to actually burn it. So achichu alei, they laughed at him. Is there actually something that is supposed to lichatchila get burned? And Tosfos points out, and you may be remembering this. Well, what about the shtei alechem? If you only bring the shtei alechem, didn't we have an opinion that said that those get burned lichatchila? Yeah, but that whole situation is not lichatchila, because really you're supposed to bring the shtei alechem with the two sheep, and so as a result, that is not a good counterexample. So bottom line is maybe that's so they laughed at him. So but yet Tani Avua de Rabbi Avin, the father of Rabbi Avin, taught the following brisa: V'chol minchas kohen kalil teyel lo seachel. Actually, we're going to see that this brisa is going to support Rabbi Abba's answer, that even though they laughed at that answer could be valid. That when it says every mincha of a Kohen is completely burned up and it's not eaten. Now, that verse in and of itself seems to have a superfluous element to it. Because why does it say lo seachel once you say kalil tiyah? Once it's going to be totally burned, of course it's not going to be eaten. So la'achila hikashtia v'lo davar acher. So in this verse, what Hashem is saying is the prior discussion was about the minchas chavitin of the Kohen Gadol, which is entirely burned, and now we're talking about the sinner's mincha. And so what it's saying is that this sinner's mincha of a Kohen is like the minchas chavitin, only with respect to eating and not with respect to anything else. Meaning that with respect to eating, just like the minchas chavitin of a Kohen Gadol, all gets burned and none of it gets eaten. So too, this mincha of a sinner who's a Kohen, none of it gets eaten. But when it comes to everything else and the burning, it's not treated just the same way. And so as a result, that shows that's exactly like Rabbi Abba said, and consistent with Rabbi Lazar, Rabbi Shimon's opinion. My Kamar, well, what is he saying? So, meaning Rashi asks, "My Ka'amar," and now we'll look at Rashi in the Kisvei Yad. It's the first of the widest lines near the end of the line. My Ka'amar, Haba Haikra Gufei Ksiv Kalil Tiyeh. I don't understand. How can you tell me that in fact that the mincha of a sinner who's a Kohen is going to not be eaten, but everything else is going to be and just like the minchas chavitin is not eaten, but with respect to everything else, the sinner's mincha is going to be treated differently. The pasuk that's talking about the sinner's mincha says kalil tiyeh; it should all be burned. So how in the world are you reading this pasuk? So Amar Abaye Hachikamar. Here's how to read the pasuk. Kol minchas kohen. Meaning you skip the couple words. Lo teachel. The every mincha of a Kohen, namely every obligatory mincha of a Kohen, namely the sinner's mincha, that is going to get not eaten. Kalil tiyeh in the middle of the verse, nidvaso, that's referring to the voluntary mincha offering. So as a result, we have a structure of A, B, A. A, the beginning of the pasuk is talking about an obligatory mincha. The end of the pasuk is talking about an obligatory mincha. But the middle of the pasuk is talking about a voluntary mincha. So Amrle Rava says, I don't like that explanation. Sakina charifa mafsaka cry. You're using a sharp knife to cut up the verse. So Ella Amarava, Kol Minchas Kohen Kalil Tiyah. Nidvaso, that when we say every mincha of a Kohen gets entirely burned, that's talking about the voluntary mincha offering. So that's the whole first half of the verse is talking about voluntary offerings. Lo seachel chovaso. And when it says that it should not be eaten, that's talking about obligatory mincha offerings. So bottom line is this verse is not talking about one kind of carbon, but two kinds of carbons. And so as a result, the first half is talking about voluntary, and the second half is talking about obligatory. Ve'epochana, well, maybe you should reverse it and say that the first half is talking about obligatory, namely that we should treat the sinner's mincha just like the minchas chavitin, and we should treat the voluntary mincha offerings of a kohen like differently. So mistabra nidvaso havalei rabuye. No, it's more likely that the voluntary mincha offering should be considered like the minchas chavitin and shekain tadira because it is more frequent, as Rashi tells us. Shekain nidvaso tadira. It's again main Rashi, not Kisvei Yad, and it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 12. 15, 18, about 20 lines up in the narrow lines of Rashi. Shekain nidvaso tadira, shiachol hisnadeh b'kol yom, kechavitin shiban b'kol yom. Just like the chavitin is brought every day, so too could a nadava be brought every day. So as a result, the voluntary offering is more tadir and therefore more like the chavitin. And lo chate, just like the chavitin is not for a sin, so too the voluntary mincha of a kohen is not for a sin. And besim reche, and it has a good smell. And there are two interpretations of this. Rashi tells us, besim reche, about 2 lines down from where we just finished. Shenidvaso v'chavitin bilulin, that when you have a voluntary offering and a chavitin offering, it is mixed b'shemen with the oil, the lavona, and with the lavona, and so as a result, the recho nodaf, and the smell goes out. And so as a result, it's got a nice smell. Masha'ain came b'minchas chote, which is not true with the minchas chote, which does not include either the lavona or the shemen. Od omrim, or we could say the following: De bezeh ubezeh ksiv reich nichoach. You know what? When it comes to both the minchas chavitin and the voluntary mincha, the Torah itself is explicit with the words reich nichoach. Lafiko minchas, lafuke minchas kote. Unlike the sinner's mincha, she'enan tadira, which is not frequent, not brought every day, uba al and comes with respect to sin, ve'ena belula b'shemen, ve'en ksiv ba reich nichoach, is not mixed with oil, and it does not have a good, and it's not, doesn't, and Torah never says it's got a nice smell. So that was position number one, and that's how we ruled. But Adarabba, maybe you could say the opposite. Chovaso hava leila rabuye. Maybe there are more bases. Excuse me for sorry for not scrolling. Maybe there are more bases for not for tying it to the tying the minchas chavitin to a sinner's mincha. After all, shukain isaron, they are both brought from only an isaron of flour. And Rashi points out that when it comes to a voluntary offering, you are allowed to bring more than an isaron of flour and chova, and both of them are obligatory, meaning the Kohen Gadol, who brings the Minchas Chavitin every day, has an obligation to bring it, and so too the sinner has an obligation to bring it. Well, Hanach Nefishin, the other one is more. We had three similarities with respect to the Minchas Chavitin to a voluntary offering, and we only had two similarities between the Minchas Chavitin and the sinner's mincha. And so as a result, we're going to make the analogy, and so we're going to say that just like a voluntary, just like the minchas chavitin is all burned on the altar, the voluntary mincha of a Kohen will all be burned on the altar. But when it comes to the sinner's mincha of a Kohen, it will not all be burned on the altar. Rather, part of it, and this again, this is all inconsistent with the position of Rabbi Elazar, the son of Rabbi Shimon. Part of it, namely the komates, will be burned on the altar, and the remnants will be put where the scattered across the location of the ashes. Okay, so the Rabbanan, what about the rabbis? Meaning, what do the rabbis do with the pasuk in this week's parsha, Vayikra Perek Vav pasuk Tes Zayin, where it says, "V'chol minchas kohen kalil tiyeh lo seachel." Again, that's going to be in, I think, Shani in this week's parsha. So it's another, lots of Daf Yomi coincidences when we're talking about mincha and we're in the Sefer of Vayikra.
How do we say that according to this opinion, that they burn the kometz, but the rest of it is scattered? Didn't we say before kol modim that everything is burned?
No, that was in our mission. That was before we were
Right.
introduced to
Right.
this third position. You're
Right. That
right.
was in the Mishnah. So how do we bring a
Well, the Rabbi
position that
Elazar is a Rabbi Elazar
disagrees
is a
with the
Tana.
Mishnah?
Rabbi Elazar is a Tana. He disagrees with our Mishnah. He's a third position. That's what I began with by saying that we're now going to be introduced to a third position that wasn't in our Mishnah. That's Rabbi Elazar.
So he can disagree with the Mishnah.
Absolutely, he can. Yeah, I mean, again, this is a quote from a brisa. He's absolutely able to disagree. V'Rabbanan. So what do the rabbis do? Hi v'chol minchas kohen kalil tiyah lo tseachel my of delay. What do they do with that verse? Look at Tanya. They use it for the following, like it's used in the following brisa. Ein liela elyona b'kalil taktar. So when it comes to the elyona, the earlier topic, namely the minchas kavitin, I would know only that it is supposed to be fully burned. The taktona below teachel, and the topic below, namely other mincha offerings of a kohen, I would know that it's subject to the prohibition of not eating. Meaning, without this verse, we would know that there is a prohibition on the burning that one must burn the entire minchas chavitin, and there's a prohibition of not eating other mincha offerings of a kohen. So how do I know that both rules apply to both situations? How do I know that the rule that it says with respect to every other mincha offering, namely that it should not be eaten, also applies to the minchas chavitin? And how do I know that the rule that it says kalil that it has to be fully burned with respect to the minchas chavitin also applies to every other mincha of a kohen. Talmud Lomar Kalil Kalil Gzeira Shava. We have the Kalil in this verse to create a Gzeira Shava. It says Ne'emar Kan Kalil, the Ne'emar Lahalan Kalil. It said Kalil with respect to the mincha of a kohen. That is the Kalil in this verse of a Chol Minchas Kohen. Kalil Tiyeh Lo Seachel. And it says Kalil above. Malahalan Kalil Taktar. Just as there, the entire thing has to go up in smoke. Avkan Kalil Taktar. The whole thing has to go up in smoke. It all has to be burned. Umakan Litain Lo Seaseh. Alachilaso, and just as here there is an explicit prohibition about eating, aflahalan litain lo sasa alachilaso. So too here it's giving a prohibition about eating. So therefore, that is what the rabbis would do with it. And so now we have solved all of the questions with respect to the three different opinions that we have with respect to what happens to the mincha of a chote who is a kohen.
What
So
is the maskana here? Can we just summarize this a little bit?
sure. So we have three opinions. One opinion says that you don't do any, that's our Tanakama, you don't do any kamitza, you just burn the whole thing on top of the altar. Position number two, Rabbi Shimon says, you do the kamitza and you burn, but you burn the whole thing on top of the altar. Both the kamitza on its part and the shirayim on its part. And then his son, Rabbi Yossi, says, no, what are you, I'm sorry, Rabbi Lazar, excuse me, Rabbi Lazar, the son of Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Lazar says that no, yes, you take the kamitza. I agree with you, Dad, that you take the kamitza, but I disagree with you as to where the shirayim go. Rather, the kamitza, like a kamitza of a typical mincha, goes on top of the altar, but the shirayim you can't eat it because, of course, the prohibition applies, but you also can't burn it because you need to. Because it's not part of the offering, and so it's not part of the. So as a result, it gets scattered where the Beis Hadeshin is really, which is the location right next to. If you're walking up the ramp, it's to the left of the ramp that goes up to the altar. So by
Okay.
Ravina,
So now we have these three opinions, but what is the lema'aseh? What did they do? What was the
well,
decision?
there's a
Stop.
disagreement as to what they did, obviously. But the
So
bottom line, I mean, obviously, if we had to decide what we were going to do, we were going to paskin like the Tanakama in general. And so as a result, we would not do the Kamitza. At least that's what I presume is how we would paskin. But of course, it's that, God willing, it should be applicable in our days, but it's not obviously applicable for right now. All right, so by Ravina, so having mentioned the prohibition of the Kohen eating his mincha, Ravina asks another question about a Kohen eating something that he should not. So by Ravina, Kohen she'achal min ha'emurin mahu. What's the story if a Kohen eats from the emurim of an animal sacrifice? Lav dezaros, lo kamibaili. I'm not asking you, just to be clear, I'm not asking you about the prohibition of a non-Kohen eating kudshim, because that prohibition would clearly apply to a Kohen eating an emurim. Because when it comes to the emurim, the Kohen is like a non-Kohen in that the emurim are not to be eaten by him. So clearly that prohibition applies. Ki kabi ba'ilei. And if you want some Rashis that help explain that, take a look at the Rashi and last Rashi in the Kisvei Yad Rashi on Ayin Dalet and Aleph, and the top Rashi in the Kisvei Yad on Ayin Dalet and Bet, as we're turning to Ayin Dalet and Bet. Ki kami ba'ilei. Where am I? Where is my question? Lav de kalil tiyeh. When it comes to the prohibition of entirely burning it. So do we say, and specifically the end of that verse where it says it should not be eaten, do we say that only applies with respect to Menachot, or does it also apply to other sacrificial portions that need to be burned? So Amarav Aaron Ravina, and again, this is nicely explained in the Rashi Kisvei Yad. Amar Rav Aaron Ravina. So Rav Aaron responds, Tashma, Detanya, Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Kol Shehu B'Kalil Tiyeh, litain lo ta'aseh al achilaso. You know what? There is a juxtaposition in this verse. Because of the juxtaposition of things that should be entirely burned with the prohibition of not eating, anytime you have something that's supposed to be entirely burned, it is subject to prohibition. And so, therefore, the emurim, which are supposed to be entirely burned, would be subject to the prohibition of eating. And so, as a result, a Kohen who eats a murim is essentially subject to two prohibitions. One, the natural prohibition of any non-Kohen eating kodshim, and that applies to him because with respect to these emurim, the Kohen is like a non-Kohen in that he's not supposed to be eating it. And he would also be subject to the prohibition of a Kohen, where it says Kalil tiyeh lo teachel. So as a result, when you're not supposed, just as you anything that's supposed to be burned, the Kohen is not supposed to eat. So that brings us to the next Mishnah, and we've mentioned the offerings that involve a kamitza in the opening Mishnah of our parak. So now we list those that do not involve kamitza.
But
So
isn't it forbidden to eat the emurim for anybody, Cohen or non-Cohen?
absolutely, I just said that.
I know. So I mean, what is the Gemara
The
trying
question
to
is
say?
whether you're subject to one set of lashes or two sets of lashes.
Oh, so in
Yeah.
this case he's subject to two.
The Kohen would be subject to two, it seems, whereas a regular person would only be subject to one. Obviously, you need to get the warnings, etc. But
Right,
that
right.
would okay. Mincha, that would be one. Another ramification would be what how many if you did it accidentally, how many chatas offerings do you have to bring? Here, he would probably have to bring two chatas offerings. So those would be two practical ramifications of the difference. Mincha, but excellent question. Minchas Kohanim. So when you have a mincha of Kohanim, minchas Kohen Mashiach, or the mincha of Chavitin that we say that the Kohen Gadol brings every day, or minchas Nesachim, or a mincha that is just part of the libations that are with a libation offering. That's the mincha that accompanies every ola and shlamim as detailed at the end of Parsha Shlach. So that those offerings, all of them lemizbeach, they all go to the altar. Ve'ein behen lekohanim, and the kohanim don't get any of them. Ubazeh yafek koach mizbeach mikoach hakohanim. And when it comes to these, the right of the altar is stronger than the right of the kohanim. And the Gemara will explain what in that is what that really means in a moment. Shtei alechem, when it comes to the two loaves on Shavuot, v'lechem apanim, and the showbread every week, v'ne'achon liv kohanim ve'ein bahen lemizbeach. Those are completely eaten by the kohanim, and they don't go at all on the altar. And in this way, the Kohanim have greater rights than the altar. The Suleka, one second. Are there no other? First, we're going to start. Rashi says, take a look at Rashi, Suleka, third line down. That when it comes to the first comment of that it all goes to the altar, are these the only ones that all go to the altar? V'ha'ika ola. What about a carbon ola? It all goes part onto the altar. No, ika ora la kohanim. That the ola, the hide of the animal, still goes to the kohanim. Va'ika olas ha'of. Well, what about the ola of a bird where there's nothing that goes to the kohanim? No, ika mura notza. Its crop and its feathers are put in the Beit Hadeshen right next to the ramp and are not put on the altar. V'ha'ika nisachim. What about the nisachim, where again it says that you're supposed to? It all goes to the altar, and here we're talking about the wine of the nisachim as opposed to the mincha of the nisachim, which is what our Mishnah was talking about. No, lashisin azli, that gets poured down into the bowls that were connected via tube to the pit underneath the altar. And so as a result, that doesn't really go on the altar. Umay bazo, and what do we mean when we say ubazeh yafek koach mizbeach mikoach hakohanim? So la pukim Shmuel is coming to exclude Shmuel, to say that Shmuel's statement is not correct. Damer Shmuel, hamisnadev yayin mivio umizalfo al gabi ishim, that you take wine and you sprinkle it on top of the fire of the altar. And if that were true, then there would be a third thing that would go only to the altar and not to the Kohanim. Namely, it would be the wine. And so the fact that we didn't mention that in our Mishnah, Kamash Malan, Dilashisin Asle, so that shows that in fact it all goes down into the shisin, down into the pit underneath the Mizbeach. But you know what? While it may disagree with one statement of Shmuel, it actually proves another statement of Shmuel. Because the Amr Shmuel, Hamisnadev Shemen, Komso, Vishirav Ne'achalin, that when it comes to the oil, if you were to donate oil as an oil offering to Hashem, a kometz of it would end up getting burned on the Mizbeach, the Shirav, and the leftover is eaten by the Kohanim. Because if, in fact, it was all eaten by the Kohanim or all going to the Mizbeach, well, then our Mishnah would have mentioned it. So the fact that it's not mentioned in our Mishnah shows that, in fact, it is split between the Kohanim and the Mizbeach. And therefore, that is a support to Shmuel. Okay, next comment. Shtei alechem v'lechem apanim. We said in our Mishnah that the two loaves and the showbread are not all go to the Kohanim and none goes to the altar. V'suleika, 1 second. You telling me that there isn't anything else? What about a sin offering of a bird, where the Kohanim get the entire bird? None of the bird is burnt on the top of the altar. No, ikadama. But yeah, you're right that none of the bird is burned on the altar, but the blood of that bird is put on the altar. Va'ika log shemen al mitzora. Well, now next question: what about the log shemen of a mitzora? Isn't that going to be something that is all going to the Kohanim? Because after all, none of it is put on the altar. No, ika matanasav. No, is some that doesn't go to the Kohen because some of it is put on the Mitzorah himself. Rashi and it will take a look at both Rashi and Kisvei Yad and the Rashi itself. Ika matanosav. It's 1, 2, 3. We'll start in Rashi 6, 9, 12 lines, 11 and 12 lines down in the narrow lines of Rashi on an ayin dalam bet. Ika matanosav lebahonos to his thumb and his big toe. Delo havi kule l'kohanim. It doesn't all go to the Kohanim. And Rashi below points out matanot. It's about halfway down in the Rashi Kisvei Yad, very close to the end of the line. Matanot al haparochet. You know what else gets done with the oil? Some of the oil gets sprinkled towards the parochet, towards the curtain. That you're supposed to sprinkle from the oil with your finger 7 times in front of Hashem. So there is some that isn't going to the Kohanim, and so that's why it was not listed in our Mishnah. Umay bizo. And finally, what is the point of referencing that these specific items that go to the Kohanim all go to the Kohanim, and what are we excluding? This is telling us that the author of our Mishnah, who says that the Shtei Alechem always goes to the Kohanim, does not agree with the position that when the Shtei Alechem are brought without the 2 sheep that are also brought on Shavuot, that in fact that there was an opinion that we saw way back on Daf Mem Hey Amud Bet and Mem Hey and Mem Vav, that we saw that the position was that if the Shtei Alechem were not brought with the sheep, with the lambs, then you would end up burning them or discarding them, and that they would not get eaten. But this opinion of our Mishnah clearly follows the alternative view that says that the Shtei Alechem, like Rabbi Akiva, that when they the position within Rabbi Akiva, the position within Rabbi Akiva that says that the Shtei Alechem, when they're brought by themselves, they are not burned, but rather they get eaten by the Kohanim. Kamash Malan de Bezo Yafet Kohanim le'olam. That in these, namely in the Shtei Alechem, the right of the Kohanim is always stronger, and so as a result, the Kohanim get it. As Rashi tells us, La Puke Miman de Amar. Take a look at the Rashi Kisvei Yad. It's the last Rashi before the Mishnah. La Puke Miman de Amar. But Perak HaTechelet, we saw back in the fourth chapter, Shtei Alechem Habos B'fnei Atzman, when the two loaves come by themselves, Kishe'ein lehen kvasim, when there are no lambs that come with them, l'sreifa asyan, v'lo la'achila, that there was an opinion that said that they get burned and are not eaten. So kamash malan, so that's why it comes to teach us, that this Mishnah comes to teach us, de bizo yafa koach kohanim la'olam, that in this way the kohanim are stronger, meaning that the kohanim do get to eat it. Okay, let's see. We'll do one more Mishnah and then we'll complete for
So they're
today.
eating what? They're eating the shtei lechem?
They get to eat the shtei alechem, correct?
Even though the korbanot were not brought.
Even though the shtei kvasim were not brought.
Right.
Okay, kol menachot nasos bekli. Every vessel, every mincha that is made in a vessel, namely these are the fried minchas, namely the mincha marcheshes and the minchas machavas, so that are made in a vessel as opposed to being baked in an oven. Te'una shlosha matanos shemen. They require 3 applications of oil. Yitzika, uvalila, umatat shemen b'kli kodem la'asiyatan. So really, these are out of order. The last one is the initial placement of the oil into the vessel before the making of the mincha. Then the mixing happens second, and then in the end, there's pouring on top. So that's the order. As Rashi tells us, take a look at Rashi. We'll do both the Rashis on the Mishnah. Kol menachos nesos bekli shares kagon minchas machavas umarcheshes teunos gimel pami matan shemen. Those require 3 applications: yitzika ubelilu matan shemen. Shebetchila hayanotin hashemen bekli kodem shnesinas hasolos. Before you put any flour into the vessel, you put a little bit of oil in. Va'achar kach nosin alav hasolos, and then you put on top of that oil, you put some of the flour. V'chozer b'nosin shemen lubalul, and then you b'shemen, and then you put some oil in order to mix the flour with the oil. And then you put some more oil on top, l'kayam mitzvah yitzika, in order to fulfill the mitzvah of yitzika. And this distinguishes these korbanot from a baked mincha, she'ein kol ma'aseh b'kli, because one, it's not all done in a kli shares, in a holy vessel. Sharei nafas b'tanur, because it gets baked in an oven. She'ein te'una yitzika, and it doesn't require the last application of oil on top. But it will require the other 2 applications, the putting in the oil before you start and putting oil in to mix. And even though our Mishnah references Yitzika first, nonetheless, it's the last thing that happens. And there's what the Mishnah is trying to point out. B'shasha osi yitzika. At the time that you do the yitzika, sarach sheteheya belila naasek kafar. You need to have already done the belila, v'kodem belila, and before you did the belila, tehei mata shemen b'shibakli kodem lasiyata, and you have to put the oil in to begin with. Chalos bolalan, and now back into our Mishnah, and we're beginning of the third line before the end of the Mishnah. Chalos bolalan. If you are not talking about a mincha of a marcheshes or machvat, but rather the chalot of a mincha that is baked, well then the Tanakama says that you do the mixing of the oil with the mincha when it's already loaves. Divri Rebbe. Rabbi Chachamim omrim solas. Rabbi Chachamim say, no, you don't do the mixing when it is already loaves. Rather, you do the mixing when it's oil. And I realize that this is actually more general. This is specific, that when we say the bolulot in that we mentioned just a few moments ago, that you do the mixing, the question is has it already been baked or has it not yet baked? And now, hacholos to unos belila, the chalos require mixing, urakik and meshicha. Whereas when you do the wafers, again, those are both kinds of oven baked minchas. The wafers don't have mixing, but rather they have a meshicha, they smearing. Kates and moshkan, how do you do the meshicha? How do you smear them? Kamin ki, like a the shape of a key. Now, what is exactly does the shape of a key mean? So the Rashi Kisvei Yad says one, two, three, five lines up near the end of the line. Ki os Yavanis. It's a Greek letter, but asiyah kamin tet. It looks like a letter tet, meaning it looks like a C. Kehafrashas kodel me'etzba, like when you separate your thumb from your pointer. So again, that like again, you can make a C, you can make a U, you can make a variety of different letters, but it's basically a curve shape. Vashar ne'achal kohanim, and the rest of the oil that is not used from the oil that you have, all of that oil gets eaten by the kohanim. And we will pick up. So the Mishnah opened with a reference to a mincha offerings that are made in a vessel. So the Gemara wonders what mincha is not made in a vessel. But for that discussion, you'll have to stay tuned for tomorrow's daf. Wishing everybody a wonderful day. Looking forward to continuing to learning. I'm going to stop the recording.